Hello, everybody. Well, I timed that one perfect and it started right on time. So, welcome and good evening. Quite an exciting evening. I've got two people who are going to be in the comment area that I really, really love to have them involved. Three people. Oh, gosh, I know I have a whole bunch of people. I had asked Prepping by Faith to join us. I also asked the Roaming Prepper to join us. Both of them have, Prepping by Faith has a illness right now. She's coughing and sneezing a lot. She didn't want to do that on camera, but she's going to be adding her perception of the news reports and everything else in the comments. So please pay attention to her. The Roaming Prepper is out on an assignment, and but he stays up on top of the news. He does a great job. So both of them stay up on top of the news and really have a lot of information to share about that. Texas Redleg was in. He dropped out. See if he can't get a better connection. He will be joining us. And then I have Triple G Farms, and I feel kind of privileged because this is his first time live on camera, and so thank you very much for that. Tonight we're going to be talking about kind of putting two different subjects: the American perspective of fifth generation warfare, and I'll give you a description about that after Triple G introduces himself. We'll also be discussing this book, Unrestricted Warfare, that was written by two colonels of the People's Liberation Army Navy. And so they basically give us a blueprint of what they intend to do. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight is, can we put all these unconnected dots together and say that there's a pattern in their lack of pattern, if that makes sense. So I would like to introduce Triple G, who is joining us this evening. And I'm going to ask him to give a brief introduction and tell you a little bit about him before we get into the discussion. Hello, Jay Creature.
Hey there. How's everybody doing tonight? I hope everybody's had a good day today. And if you're somewhere else in the world, I hope that you're having a good evening or a good morning, whatever happens to be the case for you. I'm Triple G, and I'm a pharmaceutical chemist. Just to be clear, I'm not a healthcare provider. I don't have a license or anything like that, but I've just been doing drug development work for quite a long time. Started as a chemist in the laboratory and now manage drug development projects. Haven't gotten out of the laboratory and gotten a little smarter about my career. So, background, just a normal guy that I guess, having lived through several hurricanes in Florida, you kind of figure a few things out in terms of things you need to have on hand. So just leave it at that. But looking forward to the discussion tonight, and happy to contribute in whatever way I can.
Well, thank you, and feel privileged for you being here this evening. So welcome, Lisa B., Scott Hummer, Little Lone Prepper, and let me see who else I've missed. I hope I haven't missed anybody. I probably need to activate my mouse. These MacBooks are difficult to do. S.J. Mullen, Jay Creature, Adriana Turner. Just welcome everybody. So this is a really, really super important topic. So let's talk about, first, let me give you a definition of what the U.S. Army says is fifth generation warfare. So if we look back, basically sticks, knives, swords, spears, the phalanx, the line formations, and everything else, that's what they call first generation warfare. So people were basically lining up, looking at each other in kinetic form, and then going at each other. And different variations of that happened, the pyramid, the angled attack, and all these other different kinds of things. The pincer attack, which Hannibal used against the Romans and wiped out an entire legion at the Battle of Carthage. So you got all these different things. You got the Spartans and all these other things. Then about the 1600s, they came up with this thing called gunpowder. So the only thing that changed really between the phalanx formations, even up through World War I, was you had lines of people. If you think back at the Patriot and movies like that, where you had the people with muskets standing 100 yards apart and just taking aim and shooting at each other in line formation, that was second generation warfare. Now, as it moved on and we got a little bit more mobility, so like tanks and airplanes and everything else, especially in World War II, that became our third generation warfare, which was basically moving about the battlefield with high speed. That has gone on even up through Afghanistan and Iraq. Then we have fourth generation warfare, which is the use of terroristic activities. Now, these guys say that the U.S. used terroristic activities in World War II, the bombing of Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo, Berlin, indiscriminate bombing against civilian populations, that was part of that terrorism of the fourth generation warfare. And then we have fifth generation warfare now, which is basically cyber attacks, EMP, doing attacks, even acts of terrorism and sabotage that can't be attributed to the people who are doing it. So you have all these different points around the battlefield that different things are happening, but it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't look like a concerted attack, but maybe it is. So one of them could be, for example, as I was talking with Triple G, one of the examples is maybe they attack a chemical train, derail it as it's going down the line. But that's not their real target. Their real target is that line provides all the coal for a coal-powered power plant further down that powers a Minuteman rocket missile. Okay, so that's the kind of stuff that they're talking about doing. So that's fifth generation warfare. So after the Gulf War, these two colonels, and I'm not going to try to pronounce their names. I'm a Russian linguist, not Chinese. They put out this book, Unrestricted Warfare, and this was written on the 10th anniversary of the Gulf War, 1991. And so they talk about Schwarzkopf and the lessons that they've learned from it. And there's a couple key things in here I'd like to read from it. So does a single hacker attack count as a hostile act or not? Can using financial instruments to destroy a country's economy be seen as a battle? Did CNN's broadcast of an exposed corpse of a U.S. soldier in the streets of Mogadishu shake the determination of the Americans to act as the world's policemen, thereby altering the world's strategic situation? Should an assessment of wartime actions look at the means or the results? Obviously, proceeding with the traditional definition of war in mind, there is no longer any way to answer the above questions. When we suddenly realize that all these non-war actions may be the new factors constituting future warfare, we will have to come up with a new name for this new form of war, unrestricted warfare, warfare which transcends all boundaries and limits. Then the other one I want to really read for you is back here. They hate Soros as much as conservatives do here in the U.S. So when protecting a country's financial security, can assassination be used to deal with financial speculators? Can surgical strikes be made without a declaration of war against areas which are sources of drugs or other smuggled goods? Can special funds be set up to exert greater influence on another country's government and legislature through lobbying? And could buying or gaining control of stocks be used to turn another country's newspapers and television stations into the tools of social media? So, what they're talking about is, can they buy legislators and then turn them so that they become pro-Chinese? Can they affect disinformation through social media, affecting outcomes of elections? Can they buy up land and food production and all kinds of different things that are going on as we look now and say, wait a minute, why are the Chinese buying up all this land? Why are they putting in these Chinese police stations? And we start taking a look at all these dots that don't look like they're really coherent, but you know what? Maybe they are part of a greater plan. So what do you think about that, Triple G? Where are you as far as all of this crazy stuff?
Excellent question. When it comes to all this craziness, it's been building for years. It's just kind of a natural confluence of things, I think, when you have East versus West. But, when you look at fifth generation warfare, as I understand it, it's just basically warfare that doesn't involve shooting things at people, right? It involves basically sabotage and deniable stuff, blowing up rail yards and probably driving a tanker truck into a port or something like that and blowing it up, just plausible deniability stuff. I think there's a lot of opportunities for those sorts of attacks to happen. But here, from my perspective as a pharmaceutical guy, if you can get control of a country's supply chain, particularly around medical devices and pharmaceuticals, I think you've got a real problem, or we have a real problem. If you noticed earlier in the chat, I placed a couple of references into that right at the very beginning. And the reality is, China owns our drug supply, whether you like it or not. If you take any kind of medication, unless it's a biologic that has been recently approved by FDA, there's a high likelihood it's coming from overseas, and it's a high likelihood it's coming from either India or China, and mainly China. Um, Once we go to war with China, and that's probably going to happen over Taiwan, say goodbye to those medications, which is going to be a huge problem. Um, there is such an influx of drugs from China that the FDA has its own office over there so that it can do inspections of the plants there to make sure that they're meeting GMP, which is just good manufacturing practices, which are basically the regulations for manufacturing pharmaceuticals and medical devices. So it's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity for pharma and medical devices, but right now it's a huge vulnerability for us as a society. And if you are taking medications and we get into a war with China, those things are going to dry up. Blood pressure pills, insulin potentially, antibiotics for sure, things that most people use on a regular basis that their doctors prescribe them or that they get off the fish markets. For those of you who have read my stuff over on Integrated Preparedness's community section, you'll know what I'm talking about. But once we get into it with Taiwan, all bets are off. And at that point, if medications stop coming into this country from China, you'd probably see a lot more people acting out. You're going to have a lot more people dying just from simply not being able to get their medicines. And you'll probably see a reduction in the average age of the American population. So there's a lot to be said about controlling the supply chain, because that really is a huge problem. Now, you could probably make the same analogies for military supplies, chips, any number of things. We outsource or offshore those manufacturing capabilities because it's cheaper and more environmentally friendly, if you will, in countries that are outside the US. So we're going to have to do something to get some control over that supply chain issue. And if it doesn't happen in the next couple of years, you can kiss medications from China goodbye.
And one of the things I think we need to go back and look at it in perspective and take a look at what happened to us in 2020. And, there were critical medications shortages. There were, all kinds of different things. We found out that simple things like our surgical masks and our N95 masks were manufactured in China. And just that supply chain interruption and all of the boats that were backloaded or backed up in Los Angeles Harbor, that we couldn't get to the products because people weren't at work to offload those ships. So that became a major problem. And so that's going to be exacerbated should we have a war with China. I think it was Jay Creature asked a question about what happens with Taiwan. I heard the Secretary of Defense, or the Defense Minister for Taiwan, tell China that they can do what they want to, that they had 2 Tomahawk cruise missiles aimed at the Three Gorges Dam. So if you take a look at the Yellow Yangtze River, they've got 7 cities on the Yangtze River that are multi-million population cities that would be flooded within 18 hours of the time that dam blows. So we're looking at losses somewhere in the vicinity of 90 to 100 million people if that dam goes up. So, I think that's their number one defense right now. Their deterrence is the fact that they're threatening that the Three Gorges Dam. But I want to take a look. We were talking, Triple G and I were talking yesterday on the phone, and I made a statement. He kind of halfway corrected me. But to the best of my knowledge, with the exception of, and you said it was ophthalmic IVs, the 90% or more of our simple saline IV solutions are no longer made in the U.S. So just a simple thing like getting an IV is going to be extremely complicated should that supply line go under. And correct me there on your knowledge around the availability of just simple things like simple saline and D5W and ringers and all that kinds of stuff.
Those things are getting a lot harder to get just because of the the pandemic, the global health emergency that arose, and caused as a result of the pandemic. One thing that I've seen from, reports that I've seen on FDA's website and others is that there's a lot of contamination that these things have, whether it be glass particulates or that sort of thing. So there's a fair amount of recalls of those types of things. I don't think we do a lot of that manufacturing here. There's a little bit, but not much.
We had a humongous Abbott Lab IV or normal saline plant here in Austin, and it shut down back in 95, 96, somewhere around in there. And I was told that was the largest normal saline plant in the U.S. So, now let's talk about another perspective here. What would be the opportunity to insert something into the normal medications that they are shipping and using that as a weapon, weaponizing the medications that we're currently taking? What kind of protocols do we have to prevent that from happening?
Well, to keep that from happening, you've got multiple layers of inspection from FDA. So that's not something I would really worry too much about. When you think back to the Tylenol scare back in the early 80s,
Yeah.
that was basically, and they never caught the person that did that. They were basically taking, I think, cyanide or some other poison and dropping it, taking the capsules, separating them, putting the poison into it, putting the thing back in there. And as a result of that, we now have tamper evident and tamper resistant packaging. We also have a Drug Security Act that requires that every bit of drug that's shipped from the manufacturer to the end user has to be tracked. And that's done nowadays using barcode technologies and trackers, Bluetooth trackers. And I think Apple makes certain trackers you can throw in your car to find it. It's the same sort of thing. So I don't think you're likely going to see that. And if it happened, it would happen once and then it would be over. Those products would never come back into the country. So that piece, I don't think is something that worries me. But, in terms of like a terrorist attack, and I think you said terrorism was fourth or fifth generation?
Fourth generation, yeah.
Fourth generation. I mean, that's still something that you have to think about. And from my perspective, I think our ports are probably the most vulnerable infrastructure that we have, just because it's just too easy to take a tanker full of gas or something like that and blow it up right next to a plant or something like that. When you look at the port in Tampa, Florida, you'll see that there's an enormous anhydrous ammonia storage facility. Well, the little known thing about anhydrous ammonia people didn't really pay attention to is that that's really explosive stuff. And we saw it blow up in Beirut, 2 or 3 years ago? And I think it netted out to be a half kiloton or a 1 kiloton size of explosion. When I worked there in Tampa, the local fire department would come through my facility just to look at it and make sure that they understood, the ins and outs of the labs and where all the poisons were, all the hazardous substances were stored, and so forth. We just got to talking to them, and basically the ammonia, anhydrous ammonia that is used for refrigeration at the Tropicana plant, if that ever went up, it would flatten everything for about 5 miles around it. So there's a lot of industrial chemicals and places like that you can really find yourself up a creek. And now we've seen, of course, people shooting out the electric stations and doing all those sorts of things. Well, if somebody gets a hankering, they could probably take a big bite out of our infrastructure and not be real difficult about it. And it would be plausibly deniable.
Well, I worked in the electric power distribution. As a matter of fact, I think we might even just borderline your area. I was the HR director for Heart of Texas Electric Co-op. and so they do like 7 different counties. But we got regular reports on attempted takeouts of the electric grid while I was there, and it's crazy, the amount that's going. We had a question that I wanted to get here. So anyhow, it's Little Lone Prepper is asking. I don't remember the video, but someone who lives in Texas said a lot of Chinese people in the horde gathering at the border and getting the surge into the country. I saw the videos of that, and they're even admitting that they're Chinese. So here's something. Here's Lee's perspective, and then we'll get Triple G's perspective. Number one, they're all military age men. Number two, they all have very short haircuts. Number three, they're very well dressed. So as an intelligence analyst, I look at certain things. And these guys are crossing not in dirty clothing like you would typically see people crossing the desert. They don't even have dirty shoes. They have brand new shoes on. So that tells me that they probably were bused to the border crossing area, and didn't walk. They didn't pay the coyotes. Something is going on. But when you have a busload of 30 or 40 military age men all by themselves, no minors, no women, they're all well dressed. They all have unworn shoes, basically brand new shoes. That kind of gets my cackles up, and I get thinking. I get very suspicious about it. Your thoughts?
Well, I read an article this morning on Fox, I think, and basically what they were saying is that the average South American or Central American pays $8,500 to the cartels to get smuggled across the border and into Texas or Arizona. The Chinese are paying between $35,000 per person and $60,000 per person. They are all military age males from what I've seen. And when you start talking that kind of money, then you're talking about state sponsorship. There's no way that the average Chinaman is going to be able to afford that. I mean, they do make good salaries, don't get me wrong. Then they're very high-tech people, and they have a very burgeoning middle class and that sort of thing. But that's a lot of money per person, and that requires some state sponsorship. And these are all young guys, military age, probably have some background with PLA, could potentially anyway. And they come directly to Border Patrol. They're not afraid of getting caught and processed because they're not getting vetted closely like they need to be. At least that's what I read today. Now, you can draw what you want from that. But a lot of these guys look like the young China folks, Chinese students that we would see in chemistry graduate school back in the early 90s when I was at Georgia Tech. So, and back then it was a little bit of a different China. China was a bit more closed, especially after Tiananmen. They weren't as open as they are now. And when the Chinese students would come from China, if they were married, the spouse had to stay back in China in order to ensure that that person came back. And also, if an American instrumentation repair guy went to China to fix a mass spectrometer or infrared thing or something like that they might have in one of their labs, they'll take your passport and they won't give it back to you until the job is done. It's a hardcore place. It's not quite that bad now. So the fact that we're seeing all these people flood through here, I don't think it has to do with seeking freedom.
No, my next door neighbor was allowed to come. He was a mechanical engineer, and he was working on his doctorate at his PhD at UT, and so he was allowed to do that. His wife came. She was a physician, so he was. And he had a job at 3M. So he designed all the cooling fans for all the overhead projectors and all that kinds of stuff. And she was a physician. And then they kind of asked him if he would take his parents because they were now of retirement age. And so they were willing to get rid of anybody that was of retirement age and send them to the States. And so his father was a retired Red Army sergeant. And, he would be out doing his Tai Chi early in the morning. But it was strange that they didn't want to keep the people they had to pay for the retirement. They wanted to get those over to the U.S. and make them be our burden rather than theirs.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the case anymore.
I mean, I don't think it's something that I would live in fear of, right? I think I would just be aware of it. You know, it's a potential threat, but it's something you can mitigate through just personal readiness. I'll say it that way.
Awareness, being, keep your head on a swivel and see what's going on around you. Let's talk real quickly about all these train derailments. There seems to be um, this pandemic of train derailments. And what are your can't put we can't put these together yet, but they sure are coincidentally disconnected and a plethora of them all at the same time. What are your thoughts there?
It does seem that there's an inordinate amount of them occurring. Certainly, a statistically likelihood that it's not just random. So, if this was a drug trial, I'd say that the p-value was probably less than 0.05, that it was caused by randomness, right? Whether it's just craptastic infrastructure that hasn't been maintained, or you've got people out there actually cutting the tracks. I'm not sure, but I certainly wouldn't rule out one or the other.
Well,
I haven't made a definitive conclusion on it, but as I just stated about China, I'm aware of it. I'm thinking about what the mitigations are and acting accordingly.
and I kept telling people I couldn't connect the dots. There were too many of them happening, but they were in strange places, and
Yeah,
it seems like all of them had the opportunity, and all of them involved chemicals in the trains,
yeah,
and there were chemical spills with each and every one of them. There's a lot more stuff being transported other than chemicals. So why are only the chemical trains having the derailments, and why are they usually near a waterway?
yeah.
And so that just kind of, that starts in my mind. I start thinking, whoa, there's some things here going on. What about food production and all these silos and the 18,000 dairy, and then the bird flu and the turkey flu and the oh gosh, you name it, and it's happening. It seems like, as far as food production, and they talk about that in here is getting rid of the food production so that it lowers morale and then makes people susceptible to wanting change, causing chaos, basically.
Well, are we allowed to talk about the China virus?
No,
Okay.
well, we
So,
can. We just can't call it by its real name.
so what I'll say is that, the global health emergency began in what, fall of 19?
December of 2019. Yeah.
Yeah. I suspect it was a little earlier than that. And I personally think it was just an escape from the lab. It was an accidental one, too. And the reason that I think that is that in the first month, the Chinese took a brigadier general, a lady who's the head of their biowarfare group, completely heads up all their biological warfare, and they put her in charge of the response. And then they started welding people into their apartments. Now, what that tells me is that they may have had something accidental that they were not expecting, and it seems very un-Chinese like to create such a problem, because there was a lot of blowback on China for this one. Um, and so it doesn't seem to me to be a purposeful thing. But what's the next thing going to be? Well, in my opinion, it's probably going to be a variation of the bird flu. I know that there's been a lot of people talking about this Ebola type of thing that's going on over in Africa. I
Uh-huh.
can't remember the name of it. I think you had posted something about it,
Yeah.
and I
And
just
I
can't remember the name of the virus. It's some kind of a virus that makes you bleed out, essentially.
it's
No,
basically a form of Ebola, yeah, but and it's only transmitted by body fluids.
yeah,
So
those things will burn themselves out in 2 to 3 weeks time. So
there we
that's not
go. Little lone prepper and Scott Hummer, Marburg.
Marburg. That's it. Yeah, thank you. So that doesn't really worry me. But if you get bird flu that that essentially, humanized bird flu that is transmissible through respiratory, uh, that's going to be a huge problem. That probably will have a 20 to 30% kill rate on
Well, I think the three critical things we always have to pay attention to are: number one, what's the transmission mode? So of course, if it's airborne, it's a lot easier to transmit than if it's by bodily fluids. Number two, what is the R naught on it? And so that is how many people will you infect before you become um, incapacitated and incapable of infecting others. And then number three, what is the mortality rate? And so you got to take all three of those things into consideration. But in reality, if you can just get people locked up for 2 weeks in their home, or quarantined in a hospital or something like that, even overcome or overwhelm the medical system, as we saw happen in 2020, our healthcare systems were totally overwhelmed with what was presented as inpatient, just unbelievable. Um, so Jay Creature has a question here for you, Triple G.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by the crate snake, but don't step on snake.
We had one in Vietnam that we called the two-step snake, but it was really small. It was only about the size of a pencil. And the only place it could get you was like in these areas in between your fingers and your toes. It didn't have a very large mouth at all. But once you got bit, you had two steps before the venom got you, and that was it. So
that's pretty quick.
Yeah. Well, what about the food production and going on here in the U.S. or lack thereof? It seems like China is buying an awful lot of food production, and they're exporting all of it. They're hoarding an awful lot of food. And then number two, of course, Bill Gates is buying up a lot of the food production as well. So it seems like we're losing a lot of the smaller farms to those too. Of course, China bought Smithfield Foods, that's one of our primary poultry and pork production companies here in the U.S. That's now owned by China. And then we had this 18,000 dairy cow explosion. I've never heard anything like that before.
I've never heard that before either. That was a new one on me. But if you remember, when I was growing up in Atlanta in the mid 80s, the Japanese were buying up every skyscraper in Midtown Atlanta, and they were doing the same thing in New York and elsewhere. And then, of course, the 1987 stock market crash, and they stopped doing that. They had to sell them at fire sale prices. If you listen to Steve Smith at all over on Integrated Preparedness, he's like, "Hey, don't buy land now." He's right. But in terms of food production, we don't have as much control over it as you might like. However, that's a risk you can mitigate. And I think you gotta think about risk and risk mitigation. That's kind of how I see it. And so if the risk is that food production is going to be a problem for you, then how do you get around that? If you listen to Joe Fox, he's pretty good about saying "coup hemp," come out of here, my people.
Uh-huh.
He and I don't say, I'm just going to be honest, he and I don't see eye to eye on everything, and I doubt any of his listeners see eye to eye on everything. But that man is right, and he's right 9 times out of 10.
Oh, yeah. He's retired Special Forces.
Yeah.
And he was, I think he and one of the guys that I went to Korea, we did the counterterrorist stuff for the Seoul Olympics in '88. And my team commander was John Peel. He was a major in the Special Forces as well. I think the two of them were kind of, they hooked up with each other. But
I'm not sure why that name rings a bell, but it does. John Peel.
Yeah. He's a great, I tell you what, he's one of the best leaders I've ever had. For the 6 months I was in Korea, I worked directly for him, and he was just phenomenal. I mean, I tell people my time with the Special Forces, I am barely qualified to shine their boots, and those guys are just phenomenal.
So can we just touch on something super quick since we were talking on China? I don't know if you guys realize it, but here in Texas, fentanyl is a problem. Fentanyl, whatever you want to call it, and I'm sure it is nationwide. Fentanyl is basically an opiate, and it's a huge problem. It's why Narcan exists, is to counteract the symptoms that occur from an overdose of fentanyl. So how that product gets into the country? Well, I'm glad you asked me that. So how it gets in is chemists fly over to Mexico from China. Okay. And they bring the precursor materials with them. And then they cook it up in labs in Mexico, probably 2 to 3 months. They train the cartels how to make this stuff, but the precursor chemicals come from China. Now remember, I said that's where your medications are coming from too. So there's a lot that China has going on in the drug market, both in the illicit side and the legal pharmaceutical side. So, if you can imagine going to war with China, there's not going to be any more Chinese chemists flying to Mexico. Fentanyl will dry up. The drug problem is going to get way worse because people won't have their drugs. So there's a lot in play right now with China. And do I expect it to kick off in the next couple of years? Most likely. I think even, Lee, I think even you've said it may be sooner.
I don't know. Something is going to, I don't know what, but something is going to happen before the end of the summer. I think after this last weekend, what we saw up in Chicago, I'm afraid that we're getting ripe for a race war. And so that has me concerned. I think that the dollar is falling precipitously. And that's a strange one too, because when you take a look at BRICS, which is right now probably the main instigator of the devaluation of the dollar. You've got Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South America. Now, Brazil and South America really kind of get me, but Russia, India, and China. Russia and India both have had major border wars with China over the course of the last 70 years. And so what we see happening, and China's done a very good job of propagandizing this, is they're telling the world that we're the bad guys. And so now what you have is the enemy of my enemy, Sun Tzu, is my friend. So they've formed this coalition of 5 countries. 2 of them, they're natural enemies to counter the US. And now they're trying to get other countries in, like the Philippines. They're really working hard to get them. Panama, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Mexico. And so they're really getting a lot of these countries to work very solidly against the U.S. and the destruction of the U.S. And so that's really kind of crazy. Yeah, I was. My dad was in Korea. He was there as a tech rep and for ARMCOM, Armament Command, and he was there with the second ID, just not very far from where we had the tree cutting incident, where 2 Americans were killed. They were killed with hatchets or axes by the North Koreans. I think that was in 1972, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, that was crazy. There's all kinds of crazy things that go on in Korea. Well, any questions you all have? Because I think we pretty much touched on the vast majority. We got the dollar devaluation. We've got the drugs coming in. We've got the legal drugs that we need that could be curtailed. As far as what if they decided just to embargo? We've got one of the things they talk about in here is buying politicians. We find out now that there's proof that there's 9 different Bidens who have been on the payroll of the Chinese ever since Joe was vice president. We've got all these, let's call it suspicious derailments, food accidents, and everything else going on inside the United States. We see probably bank failures, international bank failures, and they talk about that a lot in this book as well. And this is only 150 pages. This is a great read. Unfortunately, I ran out of tabs and I used up 2 highlighters, but it's just a phenomenal book. Strongly recommend you get it and take a look at it and say, is this really coming to fruition here in the United States? And I think part of it too is using social media to divide us. And I think that's part of what TikTok is designed to do. So, how is social media dividing us? And we see these contention. People no longer sit down and just talk anymore. They sit down and argue. What's going on there? Triple G, what do you think? Are we being set up to fight amongst ourselves so that the Chinese can just walk in?
Well, if you're looking for the most efficient way to wage war on a country, having them divided internally is certainly a very efficient way to go. And of course, your 5G warfare approach is probably not a bad way to go. You don't have to expend a lot of national resources to make it happen. You don't have to risk a lot of blowback. There seems to be just a lot of upside to such an approach and very little downside. Do I think that we'll see more of that? Yes. Do I think we're going to wake up one morning with an EMP bomb going off over the central USA? Probably not. But do I think that that can be accomplished through other means? Absolutely. Cyber warfare. Cyber warfare. That can shut down plants and do all kinds of bad things for a period of time. And it can cause, havoc with your infrastructure. So, yeah, I would think that if we're going to see something really bad coming down the pipe, it's going to start off with a cyber attack. That's just my personal opinion. I can't see people expending a lot of bullets and bombs and soldiers on something that they can accomplish by just wreaking havoc on a nation's infrastructure. And that, the Chinese and the Russians, the Iranians, they're very adept at doing that. And so that's what I would think.
That's something they really point out in this book is the cost of war. So if you take a look at the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, having to expend more and more and more money, especially for satellite technology and for long-range missiles and hypersonic and nuclear effectiveness and everything else, we basically bankrupted the Soviet Union in the arms race. And so then they say, now take a look at what the United States has done with Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War. Take a look at the cost of one Tomahawk missile and how many of them we threw at the Iraqi, especially the guards,
the Republican
guards, yeah. And take a look at the cost of the equipment that we spent to win that war, and the technology that we had, and then take a look at the technology and the wasteful money we spent fighting Vietnam, and then we can apply that same thing to we're fighting basically less than equal kinetic forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, and look at the expenses that the money we threw away on high-tech things against people with AK-47s and simple IEDs that they got from our expended munitions. And, did we bankrupt ourselves with our high technology fighting a low technology war? And is that going to be a continuation of how we fight in the future? And if you take a look at it, we are currently giving all of our high-tech, high-cost munitions as a surrogate to an ongoing war in Europe. And can we afford to replace those? And do we have the manufacturing capability to replace those as we expend more and more towards this surrogate war?
So the 155 millimeter artillery shells are made in Scranton, Pennsylvania, very old plant. They make 14,000 rounds per month, and maybe 15,000, but they're ramping that production up to 25,000 a month in order to try and meet the demand of the Ukrainian field artillery guys. And I cannot imagine that 25,000 rounds are being expended every month. But what do I know? I'm not a warfighter. It just seems incredible. And we are opening ourselves up to having a very degraded military as a result of giving all these munitions away. I think that we have told Zelensky that he either gets this thing done by the end of the summer or he's not going to get it done because we're just running out of munitions to throw at him. And I do think that that's why they're trying to push for an offensive right now in order to try and shut this whole thing down by the end of the summer, because literally both sides are running out of munitions. It's just going to be a matter of who grinds down first. And in my opinion, Russia's got more meat to grind. There was a report that I heard yesterday
that the Russians are running out of their tactical missiles, tactical rockets. And what they're doing is they're taking their surface to air missiles and adapting them, especially the S-300, and using it in a surface to surface role instead of a surface to air role because they're running so critically short of SSMs. It's crazy. So prepping by faith, that's a very good comment. Thank you very much. Yes, it removes culpability from our government because they can plead they never saw it. They never understood it. They didn't connect the dots. And that's where I was just a month ago. I was telling people I don't see anything where I can connect the dots. And I think now that I understand that the whole intention of this fifth generation war is to never be able to connect the dots, never be able to assign blame to our adversary, that everything is done surreptitiously so that we don't really know what's going on. And you are absolutely right. We can't fight because we can't assess blame, and we don't know how to counter it, and we don't know how to prevent it. So if we take a look at the structure of the U.S. model versus the Russian model, our fighting forces, and we have three combat arms, basically. We have the infantry, artillery, and armor. And then I guess you could add into it the air assault, the helicopters that we have would be a fourth one. But the H-64s and things like that. But we have about 20 to 24% of the U.S. military is direct war fighters. And then 76 to 80% of the rest of the military are combat support and combat service support. So we focus a lot on maintenance, on getting food, bullets, and Band-Aids to the front lines. And so, we have that 3-to-1, three supporters for every warfighter. That's flipped on the Russian model. They have three warfighters for every support person. So they are very heavy in the attack, and that's showing in their lack of supplies, their low morale because of lack of food, lack of winter clothing, and all kinds of other things is what we're hearing. And that's why a lot of them are just simply defecting or surrendering. Thoughts around that?
Well, I think when you look at the Russian military, we always thought that they were this incredible, force to be reckoned with. That they were going to come through the Fulda Gap and use tactical nukes and overrun NATO and all the things. And that was back in the 80s. Nowadays, you just look at this and go, the corruption is so bad over there. Their generals have been siphoning off the defense money. I've read that there's a number of Porsches and Mercedes Benzes outside the high command buildings over there. Well, it looks like rusted AK-47s are the result, and that's what they're issuing. I mean, I've even seen pictures of guys getting issued Mosin Nagants from World War II. It's really bad, the state of their military. I can't believe it's that bad. I thought that they were going to roll over Ukraine in 3 days, maybe 4. No, that hasn't happened. And, the Ukrainians are much more technologically advanced and also advanced biotechnically speaking than the Russians are. And that's where the Russians did all of their nuclear engineering and the testing of their nuclear packages, the physics package and all that. That's where they manufactured all that stuff back in the Soviet Union days. And so, Ukraine had one up on them, and I just can't see this ending very well for Russia, except the fact that Ukraine could easily get worn down if they run out of weapons, which is going to be a problem for them at the end of the summer.
Yeah, I've heard rumors that they're pulling T-62s and T-54-55s out of stockpile,
Yeah,
or out of their what would you call it?
They're pulling them out of eastern Russia. They've been in storage in eastern Russia, and they've been seen on railroad tracks. You can see them over on Twitter. There's railroad cars just full of these T-55 tanks from Korea, I guess.
Well,
Um,
that was the year they were manufactured, the 54, 55, and then of course the T-62 was the one that they designed to come up against the M60. So, 60, 62 there for both of us, and then the 54, 55 was the primary tank of most of the Israeli, Egyptian, Syrian wars and things like that. That was a primary Arab tank during most of those battles. So that's something else, and that's that's not necessarily great tanks. But then we get into that economic thing again. Now we're looking at a tank that probably costs, you know, let's say $250,000 to produce, and we're going to take care of it with a $3 million anti-tank rocket. So
do you ever do you ever wonder why it is that we keep spending so much money in deficit spending? We know that we're not going to pay it back. I'm sure that our enemies who we have borrowed from have figured out that we're not going to pay it back. And so, in my opinion, the only way that that can really end is in war. Because if you can't pay it back, you're either going to have to defeat the enemy or he's going to have to defeat you to get his money back.
well, if you take a look at it historically, every time we get into financial difficulties, we resolve it through war.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Great Depression was only ended because we nationalized everything and we put the women to work and put them in the factories and sent the men off to die in foreign wars. And that's what got us out of the Great Depression. So that, but then we created a new problem. And every time we try to solve a problem through war and through social economic change like that, we create new problems that we have to address afterwards. But we're always saying that dog doesn't bite yet, so we can go ahead and wag its tail. Let me see here. Oh, I did see something that said that Putin has cancer, and that
Yeah.
there's some concerns that he may be replaced here in the near future.
If he's replaced, it's just going to depend on who he's replaced with and what that disengagement from Ukraine happens to look like. I don't see the Russians going and paying reparations to Ukraine after the end of this thing and rebuilding all the things they've destroyed.
No, no.
I just don't see that happening. And, if Russia keeps throwing people at this like they are, they're not going to have much of a future in 20 years because there's just not going to be that many people left.
Well, they already had a deficit on the man to woman ratio
Yeah.
because they lost an entire generation during World War II. And that's difficult to catch up with because that's why you see so many advertisements every time I come on YouTube or before the war, you would see meet Russian women, and now it's meet
Yeah.
Ukrainian women,
Yeah.
and that's because they just don't have enough men, and now we're killing them off like you would not believe on both sides.
Yeah.
It's just it's almost like a World War II Battle of the Somme, or
Yeah.
something like that as far as the fatalities. And I think that or what's the name of the city is becoming a modern version of Stalingrad.
Bakhmut.
Bakhmut, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That place has been leveled 5 times over at least. The amount of shells just raining down on it and the amount of combat video you see coming out of there is just incredible. And you wonder when you're looking at it, how in the world are people able to survive this?
Well, and the good thing is they have good underground as far as basements and stuff like that, and they have the underground metros and stuff like that that are protecting them a
Yeah.
little bit from that collateral. And remember, it was the Soviet snipers in the factories, especially the tractor factory in Stalingrad, that ended up defeating the Germans more than anything else. Do I think we are the collateral? I do. I think our government. There was a video. I think it was Alaska Prepper put it out, but and he said this is the scariest thing he's ever seen, and it was an interview with one of the uh, Fed chair people. And he said that you don't have to worry about your money in the banks because they can print as much as they need to meet our demand. And that's kind of scary because that's just the way our government thinks is they can print our money situation enough to get us out of any problems that we might have. I'm not an expert in finances, that's for sure. I had to get my mouse going because Using the keypad's kind of difficult here. So Jay, I am, of course, I was a Russian analyst. So when I take a look at the size of a tank division, the size of a motorized rifle division, the size of a parachute division, when I take a look at the capabilities that they have, air delivery, they don't have any aircraft, any transport aircraft capable of trans-Pacific capabilities. And even if they did, they don't have any air-to-air refueling capabilities. So let's give them credit. Let's say that they do have the capability to fly from, let's say, Vladivostok or Kamchatka all the way to the west coast of the U.S., let alone Colorado. They would have to survive all of our naval anti-aircraft capabilities, our surface-to-air missiles, and everything else, as well as our western shore defenses. Let's assume that they still get 100% of the people that they launch on against the West Coast. They're only going to get about a division at max, and then they would have to return all those aircraft back to get another division if possible. Same thing with their ships. They don't have enough. They've lost 3 Alligator-class landing craft in the Black Sea. So they don't have any ocean-growing assault ships, landing craft that are capable of bringing more than, say, a regiment towards the U.S. So the idea that we're going to have a Red Dawn type of an event happen here in the U.S. is slim to none. However, I am getting scared. If China continues on this path of allying themselves with Venezuela, Nicaragua, Panama, especially if they get into it with Mexico, then they have a friendly port and they could start moving those assets over to the friendly port. That's when I would become scared. But until that time, I'm not that worried. What do you think there, Triple G?
It's hard to say. It's just hard to say. I don't see us getting invaded realistically. Nobody's got that kind of supply chain. You know what I mean? Nobody's got the ability to fly in here and start dropping paratroopers out of the air into land passes. Do they have the ability to bring terrorism through the border as porous as it is? Yes.
Whoa, my mouse did something. I didn't know what it did, but I lost it for a second. So sorry.
All right. Okay, cool. He's back.
Yep. But anyhow, so to your point, Pat, there were 2 tornadoes hit Lawton today, the Lawton Fort Sill area. I saw that on Mary Greeley News. Gosh, I'm trying to get this so that there we go. Okay. Let me see what we've got anything here. So Ingrid, welcome. Glad to see you. Our guest is Triple G from Triple G Farms is his channel. He doesn't put any videos out, but he does an awful lot of support, especially on Integrative Preparedness channel. He puts a lot of information up in their community page. And then, of course, he puts in a lot of great comments here on this channel. He's one of my moderators and just does a fantastic job, both moderating as well as adding content. He is a pharmaceutical chemist here in Central Texas with a lot of experience. And so just a great all-around, extremely knowledgeable person and somebody I'm very privileged to have here on this live. Let me take a look here.
Yeah, if you guys go to my channel, you're not going to see all that much on my YouTube channel. You might have 3 or 4 videos, and they're not very long.
So the question was, are the Ukrainian women interested in old fat guys with gray hair? And I am quite certain they are. So we belong to our community seniors club at the rec center. and we do a trip every month. And there's a 55-year-old Ukrainian woman, and she's married. And so I overheard her talking to a friend. I said, "That's an interesting accent you have." She says, "Well, I'm Ukrainian." We started speaking in Russian, and I started teaching her Spanish because the conjugation of verbs is very similar in Russian and Spanish. And so I was able to help her study her Spanish by converting it instead of English to Spanish, which becomes more difficult, from Russian to Spanish. And so that helped her to understand it. And so the bus driver says, "My wife is never going to believe this, that I had two people, a guy teaching a woman how to speak Spanish by speaking it in Russian." And that's how it is. But so, okay. Let me see if there's no more questions. We are right at 9 o'clock. And so thank you very much. I'm going to strongly encourage two things. Number one, get on Wikipedia and look up fifth generation warfare, or look up the 5 generations of warfare, either one. I'll put links to those in the show notes tomorrow morning. Get a copy of this book. I'll put a link to it. There were only 4 copies left at Amazon when I bought it. But this is going to give you everything. This is the blueprint that we're seeing unfold here in the U.S. on what the Chinese are doing. And this is written by 2 colonels of the People's Liberation Army Navy. And it's a fantastic book. Triple G, any final thoughts you'd like to share before we close it out?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things. One, there's going to be a fantastic guest coming on tomorrow. And that's with Steve Smith. He does these types of books, the Stonemont books. Let me see if I can get him up there. Maybe not. But anyway, you get the picture. And he's going to be on Lee's channel tomorrow night. And that's going to be an exciting type of thing. In terms of the things we've talked about today, if you're reliant on Chinese-made products, whether it be oil filters, medicines, what have you, you need to start stocking those things up, because we are not going into a good place right now internationally with them. That's just reality. So what does that mean for you? If you need extra meds, you need to talk to your doctor and just tell them your concerns, and can he have you write an extra few scripts to have on hand? That's what we do. So, manage it. Think of it as risk. Here's the risk, and here's the risk mitigation. Put the two together, and then you solve your problems, and just do them one problem at a time. Don't try and get overloaded with 20,000 problems and things that need to be done. Take them one at a time. You'll be amazed how quickly that adds up.
So to kind of build on that, I know we can be overwhelmed. We say that there's all kinds of malarkey going on out there, and that we have all these threats that we're currently facing. And so what I would encourage you to do is say, what are the things what are the mitigating factors? What are the things we can do to prepare that are in common amongst all those? Food, water, sanitation, medication, self-defense. If you can focus on those 5 things and be well prepared in those 5 arenas, I think you've got it made, regardless of which one of the scenarios happens to us. So let me see. The Ghost Fleet. Oh, wow. Total fiction of Great World War III. I was telling Triple G, I'm in the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. And so we go out and help people with rent and things like that when they have problems, and food and all that kinds of stuff. And so I usually go with John, who's the president of our chapter here in the local area. And we've been talking, and so he told me to read this one. So he gave it to me today. We went out on a ride today, and we're going out on to visit another neighbor tomorrow. So I'll be giving him this copy to read while I'm reading his. But that's kind of how we are. So let me see, Pat Butler. So I will read. I will put Ghost Fleet on my list. Thank you very much. So I was in California in 1971, 74, and 77. Basic Indonesian, basic Russian, and advanced Russian. All 3 of those were for 1 year. But I loved Monterey. Okay, so here we are. This is how you shall bless the Israelites, saying to them. And this is Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord let his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you kindly and give you peace. Please, please, please remember that we're all in this together so we can come out the other side together. Be kind, polite, and respectful to each other. And thank you, Triple G. What a great evening. Thank you for being such a wonderful guest. We're very appreciative of your knowledge, expertise, and your thoughts. And we'll have to get you back on again at some point in the future. So
No problem.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you being here. Take care.
Y'all have a good night.